My name is Leslie Thompson. I'm Director of Adult Programs at the Sid Richardson Museum, and I'd actually like to begin first with a land acknowledgement, which pays tribute to the original inhabitants of the land that we are on. So we, the Sid Richardson Museum, respectfully acknowledge all Native American peoples who've lived on this land since time immemorial, and the Sid would especially like to acknowledge and pay respect to the Wichita and affiliated tribes, which include the Waco, Wachai, the Tawakani, and the Teovea, upon whose historical homeland our museum is located. So we have a very exciting program for you tonight called Buffalo Bill in Kinshasa, Westerns, Violence, and Masculinity in Tropical Africa. And I'm going to go ahead and close this poll. And you'll learn, I'll share the answer later on if it's not addressed during our presentation tonight. So now I imagine that many of our attendees and viewers are familiar with Buffalo Bill Cody, whether it's by name or by his legend. And here at the Sid, Buffalo Bill can actually be found in our collection with a painting from 1917 by Charles Russell entitled Buffalo Bill's Duel with Yellow Hand. And I'm gonna, I've just pasted the link into the chat box where you can find an image of the painting. And this is the title of the painting is Buffalo Bill's Duel with Yellow Hand, although it's been erroneously translated as Yellow Hand. It was actually Yellow Hair, who was a member of the Cheyenne tribe. And the artist Charles Russell was commissioned to paint this scene shortly after Buffalo Bill's death that same year in 1917. And you actually can visit this painting virtually through our 360-degree virtual tour feature on our website. And I'll also leave a link to that in the chat box as well, so you can explore that later on. Now, Buffalo Bill Cody is a figure who looms large in the imaginations of the American West, and whose reputation is known far and wide. Not only did he himself actually travel around the US, but he also traveled across the pond in Europe as well. But what I did not know was just how far-reaching his impact was, and in the case of tonight's lecture, all the way to Central Africa. So as we'll learn tonight, iconic figures like Buffalo Bill, like the Lone Ranger, and other cowboys of popular Western films from Hollywood became role models for young people of Kinshasa in Belgian Congo, and particularly in helping form their identities. And of course, we'll hear more details tonight as how that came to be. But before we do, I want to share a little bit of Zoom housekeeping for tonight's program. Before I introduce our guest speaker, I just want to bring your attention to a couple of features on Zoom. And the first one, of course, is the chat box, where I've already put a couple of links there for you. And that is available for you to engage in conversation with us and the speaker and other attendees. But there is also another feature I want to bring your attention to, and it is the Q&A box. Depending on what device you're logging into, it could be at the top of your screen, it could be at the bottom of your screen, but on your control panel, you'll see a Q&A box. And this is where I would like for you, if you have a question at any point during the presentation, please type your questions into the Q&A box. It'll help us congregate them all into one location. So at the end of the talk, we can go through the questions more efficiently there. And I think that's it for housekeeping rules. So with that, I'd like to introduce you to our guest speaker tonight, Professor Didier Gondola, who teaches African history and Africana studies at Indiana University, Purdue University, Indianapolis, or IUPUI. He earned a PhD in African history from the Université Paris 7 in France. His publications include numerous books, articles, and chapters on popular cultures, gender and post-colonial issues in Central Africa, and the African diaspora in France. In 2008-2009, he was selected as a U.S. Department of State Fulbright Scholar and carried out both research and teaching activities at the Université de Kinshasa in Congo. And in 2011-2012, as a senior fellow at the Nantes Institute for Advanced Studies in France, he developed his manuscript for the Tropical Cowboys, which is the title of the book. You can see an image of the cover here on the screen, from which tonight's presentation is drawn. And then in 2015-2016, he spent a year-long research leave at the Collegium of Lyon, France, and worked on a collaborative project that focuses on the emergence of HIVs in colonial Africa. And he's recently embarked on a research project dealing with the Chinese social footprint into African cities, Libreville in Gabon and Kinshasa in Congo. And tonight we are honored to have him with us virtually to talk about a fascinating, what I think is such a fascinating chapter of our history, and looking at the influence of Buffalo Bill Cody and Hollywood Westerns on youth subcultures in 1950s Belgian Congo. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and mute my mic, and I will pass it over to you, Didier.
Yeah, I unmuted. Can you hear me? Very good. First of all, I really would like to thank the Sid Richardson Museum for having me, and especially Leslie for identifying me and inviting me with your email to be part of this this event tonight. Thank you very much, and thank you to the audience. I look forward to the Q&A at the end of my lecture. I'd like to, as a disclaimer, just let you know that I am not a specialist of Buffalo Bill studies. I'm not an expert on Buffalo Bill, but interestingly, Buffalo Bill really looms extremely large in my work on masculinity in the Belgian Congo during the 1950s and the 1960s. And I'm going to show you how. Now, Leslie mentioned a little bit about Buffalo Bill, who he was. This was a very, very important character of the American West. And of course, you know, when you hear the name Buffalo Bill, what comes to your mind is the American West. You think of Buffalo Bill, the icon. You think of him as a legend. You think of Buffalo Bill really was a scout who was credited for kind of expanding the frontier, expanding the manifest destiny out west. And what's interesting about Buffalo Bill is that there were a lot of people during his life, and especially after his death, that kind of contributed to the iconization of Buffalo Bill. One of them, of course, you're very familiar, is an American president, former president by the name of Theodore Roosevelt, who in 1917, just a few months after Buffalo Bill Cody passed away, he accepted the vice presidency of the Buffalo Bill Memorial Association, and he really greatly contributed to eulogizing and iconizing Buffalo Bill. Now, there is also another side, another aspect of Buffalo Bill, and that's Buffalo Bill the hunter. So he was not just a scout, he was also a hunter. And that's actually where his name, Buffalo Bill, came from. And what I think is interesting, and I talk about that a little bit in my book, is that, you know, people who tend to admire Buffalo Bill also tend to sweep under the rug of history the fact that Buffalo Bill lent his hand, but also his rifle, to the slaughter of 50 million bison that roamed the plains and sustained Native American life and Native American culture, you know? So Buffalo Bill was one of the people responsible for that. There is also, and Leslie alluded to that, Buffalo Bill the entertainer and the showman. And what's interesting, as you said, Leslie, he just didn't perform in the US. I mean, there's so many places in the US where Buffalo Bill performed, but he was so popular, he was so high in demand that he decided to cross the pond, as you said. He went to London, He performed before Queen Victoria. He went to Paris. He performed before a French president by the name of Sadi Carnot. He went to Rome. He also performed before Pope Leo XIII. And that's really fascinating because he actually brought the West on stage to avid audiences. And, you know, he was traveling and performing with Indians, Native Americans, and those Native Americans, you know, they had their showy costumes. But what was so interesting about Buffalo Bill is that when he was performing in Europe with those Native American actors, some other Native Americans were actually fighting their last battles in mountains and on plains. Some other Native Americans were being starved to death on the reservations. So is this kind of ubiquity of Buffalo Bill that's really so fascinating. He's on stage, later on he's gonna be on the screen, but he's also on the frontier. He's all over the place, you know? And that's just really so amazing about him. Finally, and interestingly for me, there is Buffalo Bill the cowboy, because he also was a cowboy who he wasn't really a cowboy, but I'll tell you about that in just a few minutes. To me, I give him really credit for single-handedly transforming the image of the cowboy from an outcast to a hero. But the irony is that Buffalo Bill himself was not a cowboy. You know, he was a scout, he was a performer, he was a buffalo hunter, he was an entertainer, a performer. And I think it was as a performer that Buffalo Bill was able to endow the cowboy with this masculine mystique that later on Hollywood will hijack, commodify, and circulate with global success. So before I show you how Buffalo Bill arrived in Kinshasa in the 1950s and really kind of captured the imagination of young people there and became their eponymous hero, what I like to do, I'd like to survey the scene a little bit, because I know that many of you are probably not familiar with the Belgian Congo, not familiar with Kinshasa. Kinshasa, that's the name of the city today. Back then, because my book takes place in the 1950s, it was called Leopoldville. And the name Leopoldville came from a Belgian king by the name of Leopold II. What Leopold II created in the very heart of Africa was a very Orwellian and a very paternalistic colony. And what's so fascinating about this colony is that it's extremely unique. The uniqueness comes from the fact that for at least 20 years, this was not a colony belonging to a European power. It was actually the private property of a Belgian monarch, of an individual by the name of Leopold II. He never set foot on his colony, never went there, but under the guise of kind of spreading Christianity and spreading civilization in the so-called heart of darkness, he proceeded to really establish a reign of terror in the Congo. You know, villagers were rounded up by his army, and they were ordered to go deep into the forest to collect wild rubber. And since the men were the ones responsible for that, and to make sure that the men would go in and collect the rubber and come back with the rubber, the soldiers would actually hold women hostage. The children were hostages. And when a village failed to deliver the required quotas of wild rubber, what the soldiers would do, they would basically cut off their hands, cut off their feet. They would, you know, violate and rape the women, the children, and so on. There's a book about that if you are interested in this topic. It's called King Leopold's Ghost. It's by an author by the name of Adam Hochschild. It's an amazing book. if there's a book that you need to read, it's not mine. It's really this book. Is a fascinating book about this period. He makes the claim, and he's backed up by other historians, that during the reign of terror that Leopold II inflicted upon the Congolese people, it was called red rubber. At least 10 million people died as a result of red rubber during the time of Leopold II in the Congo. So what happened is that there was the first human rights campaign, the first international human rights campaign was launched by an African-American Presbyterian missionary by the name of William Shepherd, because he was in the Congo. He launched that because he saw the horrors of red rubber. And that first international human rights campaign was sustained by a London-based organization by the name of Congo Reform Association. So as a result, Leopold II in 1908 was forced to relinquish his private property. We're talking about a territory that's as big as the United States of America east of the Mississippi River. So the Belgian Congo was 80 times larger than Belgium. And this was a private property, okay? It didn't belong to a nation. But in 1908, as a result of this campaign, Leopold II is forced to give it back to his country, to Belgium. So what happened when Congo became a Belgian colony is that the type of violence that we witnessed before 1908 kind of disappeared. But what remained was this kind of forced labor remained, but also paternalism became, if you will, the hallmark of Belgian colonization in Congo. So Belgian paternalism meant that there was this notion that the Belgians cultivated in the Congo, because this was their only colony. They didn't have other colonies like the French, the British. They just had this one colony, the Belgian Congo, the richest colony in Africa. They cultivated the notion that Congolese men were actually big children. It's a very Hegelian notion that colonization was the white man's burden. It was their God-given mission to rescue Africans from the clutches of savagery and to kind of domesticate not just the space, but also domesticate Congolese people's bodies, Congolese people's minds. So for the Belgians, redeeming the savages, redeeming the primitive people of the Congo could only take place in a European controlled environment where they could actually showcase civilization, modernity, technology, progress, Christianity, education, entertainment. And you could guess, actually, since they were considering Congolese people and Congolese men as children, you would actually can easily guess who would be entrusted to carry out this civilizing mission. Well, the Belgian Catholic missionaries, of course, because they had a book to teach. And that book was the Bible. So in addition to evangelizing the natives, quote unquote, what the missionaries did was to also found hospitals, schools. They organized Boy Scouting. They ran all the sports activities in the Belgian colony. There was another area where those Belgian Catholic missionaries kind of a salvific intervention deployed, and this was filmmaking. They were also very much interested in filmmaking. The missionaries quickly realized that films could do a few things for them. The first thing is that, films could easily appeal to Africans because it was a new technology, especially in Africa, just new technology. Africans hadn't seen that before. So they were like, wow, it's going to really appeal to them. The second thing is that they understood that film could reach a wider and probably a younger audience, and that was also very good for them. Films could also spread educational schemes that had until then been limited to school, to religious, to training programs. Now they were using films for that purpose. So the thing is that initially, not initially, those two things were side by side. So let me just talk about the first film venture. The film venture was, okay, we're gonna make our own movies. Okay, so we're gonna make our own movies because we want to use movie to educate those people. The man, because the man, movies, those movies, homegrown, missionary movies, predicated on the ideas that the Congolese man is a big child. So we're going to treat him as a big child. We're going to educate him using this new medium that's new to him, film. So in the late 1940s, early 1950s, there was a slew of documentaries, and the documentaries were really kind of intended to educate the natives. Okay, so I'm just going to give you a couple of examples here. So those were like short documentaries, 15, 20 minutes, no longer than that, because for them, Africans couldn't, their attention span was really reduced, so we cannot have 2-hour documentary. L'heure, 1947. If some of you are familiar with French or French, l'heure means time. So they are using a documentary to teach the natives punctuality. The second movie, same year, l'utilité de la couverture, which means the usefulness of a blanket. So they are using a documentary to teach people how to use the blanket, a blanket, how to cover your body with the blanket. 1947, la propreté du corps, which is the cleanliness of the body. This one here is very interesting, the movie, the documentary in 1948. This probably is not a familiar name for you, La Brouette. Brouette in French means wheelbarrow. So this is a documentary that's intended to teach African people how to use a wheelbarrow. So it's like an 18, 20-minute documentary teaching people how to use a wheelbarrow. And then one that was geared towards a more female audience, La Propreté de la Maison, which means, house cleanliness, how to clean your house. Very interesting. So now, in addition to that venture, so we're gonna make our own films, those films are intended to educate, they are documentaries. The second venture was American movies, especially Charlie Chaplin's silent comic shows, like Tarzan movies. Those movies were chosen by the Belgian missionaries because they could easily clear the very strict Belgian colonial censorship commission. And Chaplin's silent shows were also chosen because, they were deemed to be innocuous. Certainly they had a strong entertainment value to them. Missionaries thought that Tarzan's movies could appeal to the African audience because they took place in the jungle, right? So Africans would love the jungle, to see lots of animals running around. And also the Tarzan movies had a very simple plot. So for them, that simple plot, Africans could understand that also very easily. Then in the 1950s, the very early 1950s, Buffalo Bill came to Congo, especially to Kinshasa. And there is a reason why the Catholic missionaries brought Buffalo Bill movies to the African audience. The first reason is that reenactments of Buffalo Bill Wild West shows remained extremely popular in Europe in the 1940s and in the 1950s. Until today, Buffalo Bill is extremely popular in France, in Belgium, in Germany, and so on. What's also interesting is that in the 1950s, European residents in Kinshasa usually every year they attended a very elaborate Buffalo Bill Wild West shows. You know, they had horses, they had bonfires, there was even a replica of a saloon, and people would, you know, dress up, performers would dress up in full cowboy gear. Some of them actually dressed up like Indians. This was happening in Kinshasa in the late 1940s and in the early mid 1950s. So that's the reason. The reason is that those Europeans in Kinshasa were doing Buffalo Bill shows, reenactments. In Belgium, they were also doing that. So they were extremely familiar with Buffalo Bill as a character, Western character. The second idea, the second reason why they decided to expose the African audience to Buffalo Bill is that I think that the Catholic missionaries in the Belgian Congo became enamored of Buffalo Bill because he reminded them so much of Leopold II, the founder of the Congo. The two people here that you see, Leopold II and Buffalo Bill, William Cody, they met actually only once, and this was in 1887 in the month of June in London. Buffalo Bill came to perform before Queen Victoria. As I mentioned to you, it was her golden jubilee in London. And Leopold II, related to Queen Victoria, also came, and this was the opportunity for the two of them to meet. They knew of each other's work. And I think that for the Belgian Catholic missionaries, they view them consciously or maybe unconsciously as kindred spirits, you know, people who had simultaneously tamed the wild and advanced Western civilization in terra nullius. Leopold II did that in the so-called African heart of darkness, and Buffalo Bill did that in the American Wild West. Finally, the last reason is that the globalization of Westerns in the 1950s presented the missionaries with a great opportunity to introduce Buffalo Bill to the African audience. And there is one single movie that did it, and that movie is Pony Express. It came out in American theaters in 1953. The following year, it's dubbed in French for the French audience as Le Triomphe de Buffalo Bill. And then that same year, late in 1954, that movie is shown in Kinshasa, and young people just loved it. They just loved Buffalo Bill. And they decided that Buffalo Bill gonna become their eponymous hero. Pony Express did not come alone in Kinshasa. So when I was doing my field work, I knew that those young people in Kinshasa, they were mesmerized by Western movies, and I kept asking them, so in addition to Pony Express, Le Triomphe de Buffalo Bill, could you name other movies that really kind of impacted you and contributed to launching this movement? They would always say The Lone Ranger. The Lone Ranger was the other movie. And here again, the translation in French is Les Justiciers du Far West. What those young people didn't know, and I'm sure that your audience, Leslie, also does not know, is that, so we have the Lone Ranger, and the Lone Ranger is a white man. In the movie, the first movie, it was portrayed by an actor by the name of Lee Powell. And then the TV series from 1949, 1957, the actor that played the Lone Ranger is Clinton Moore. Now, before the movie and before the TV series, there was a radio show of the Lone Ranger starting in 1933. And that radio show was actually inspired by an African-American deputy U.S. Marshal by the name of Bass Reeves, who was active in Arkansas and in the Oklahoma Territory. He is the real Lone Ranger. So very interesting that the Lone Ranger is a black man originally, just like cowboys, initially they were black people, because, white people couldn't call them cowman, because they weren't considered to be men. So they would say, hey, cowboys. That's how they got the name cowboys. But, later on, we associate cowboys with white people. But originally, it was a dirty work to do. It wasn't fancy to be a cowboy. So young people in Kinshasa were watching those movies with a lot of excitement. I spoke with some of my informants. They would tell me it was just really worse. I mean, it was wilder than to go to a soccer game. It was absolutely wild. It was a total pandemonium when they were watching those Western movies. After watching the movies, they would parlay their vision of the American Far West from the screen onto the streets, and creating in the process a very unique hybrid blend that kind of conflated the Hollywood version of the drifting cowboy with local elements of manhoods. And that's really what I want to talk about now. So those young people, they dubbed themselves Bills. So this was their names. They would say, oh, I'm a Bill. I mean, I'm saying that in French so that you hear the way they were saying it. They wouldn't say Bill like we say in English, but they would say Bill. I am a Bill. They would also use the term Bill interchangeably with the term Yankee or Yankee. So a Bill is a Yankee. It's the same thing. So each township in Kinshasa had a gang of Bills, and their job was to police the neighborhood, to prevent other gangs from encroaching on their township, to deter younger children from skipping school, even though they themselves didn't go to school, but they would also always make sure that the young people in their neighborhood are going to school. They also would prevent girls from wandering outside of the township. What's interesting here is that they also adopted nicknames from the repertoire of Westerns and other movies, and they fought really fiercely over those names. I did my research, and I came up with only one Indian name. And it's not even an Indian name. It's the name of an Indian tribe. It's highlighted there, Apache. Or in French, they would say Apache. That's the only Indian name. And what's interesting is that in this regard, those young moviegoers, they really conformed to what Hollywood Westerns attempted to convey. They were rooting for the cowboys. They were never rooting for the Indians, because in their minds, the Indians, they had little sympathy for the Indians because of the way Hollywood portrayed the Indians in those movies. And Hollywood really expected the viewers not to have sympathy for Indians at all, because Indians were the losers. They were the zeros. The cowboys were the heroes. I mean, they were the winners. Cowboys always were winning. Indians never won in those movies. So you can now understand why those Bills, who were oppressed by the Belgian colonizers, they didn't identify themselves with the Native Americans, but they identified themselves with the cowboys. And that's fascinating. Now, to be a cowboy or a Yankee or a Bill in Kinshasa, that meant to be a tough guy. One had to engage in several performative rituals that I want to talk about. The first one is bodybuilding. In their language, they call that Kintulu, bodybuilding. It was a badge of masculinity. A lot of Bills were engaged in bodybuilding. I think especially because bodybuilding kind of intersected with notions of courtship, seduction, and sex appeal. So very interesting. I'm not saying that all of them were involved in bodybuilding. There was a large segment of those young Bills that were involved in kind of overinflating their bodies. And then this actually would draw a lot of crowds. You know, a lot of people would come and to just watch them lift weights and just perform their bodies. So Kintulu, very important. It really, very important badge of masculinity. The other one, since a lot of their activities really revolved around fighting. The Bills were fighting all the time. They were constantly fighting in their neighborhoods. They were fighting over turf, they were fighting over girls, they were fighting over nicknames. So they just didn't rely on bodybuilding and martial arts, but they also relied on some magical rituals known as kamô. So let me just talk briefly about this kamô stuff. So this ritual involved two distinct procedures. The first procedure is called nzoloko, and nzoloko means, you see the incisions there on this young man's body. So the incisions would be on the temples, the feet, the wrists, because that's where you hit somebody with your head, you headbutt somebody with the head, or with your fist, or with your foot. So that's where they would cut the incisions, those three parts of the body. Sometimes even the elbow. Okay, so that's called nzoloko. So if you are a Bill and you want that, because it's going to give you a lot of strength, you go to an older Bill who's known for cutting those incisions, those nzoloko. So after the nzoloko are cut, and depending on who cut the kamô or the type of strength one was seeking, there was a particular mixture of burned powder that's known as nkisi. So this could contain animal skin, bones, claws, teeth. You know, they would grind that, they would cook it, they would burn it. So, I mean, they were actually going outside of the city. They were going to remote villages to get those things, and they would apply that to the open wounds. Now, I came to the conclusion, after listening in disbelief to informants telling me about their kamô stories, you know, that they would actually break bottles on their heads, and they would take the broken glass and swallow that and crush that with their teeth. They would swallow razor blades, needles. They would enter in a state of trance and headbutt trees and walls. So when I heard those stories, I mean, I was really amazed. I was just flabbergasted. But it really compelled me in my book to look at manhood as an ongoing construct that's fraught with tension between the self-preservation of the body and the self-destruction of the body. So they are doing that at the same, they're destroying their body, but they also want to preserve their body at the same time. So there's really kind of a pendulum movement between those two poles. And that was really interesting. And I discussed that in my book. Now, to be admitted into any formal or informal gang of Bills, one had to smoke marijuana. So that's another thing that's really important. So there is Kintulu, I mentioned. There is kamô, because you fighting all the time, you want to be really strong. So you're going to do the kamô because kamô going to give you this kind of supernatural strength. But you also smoke marijuana. If you do not smoke marijuana, you cannot be part of the gang. This was a substance that was really available in Kinshasa in the 1940s and the 1950s. And I think it really kind of served to bond bands of Bills. It allowed them to kind of dull the pain of dereliction at the bottom rung of the broken colonial urban ladder. But what I want to turn to now is to show you that those Bills, they were not just at the receiving end of colonial violence. They inflicted violence themselves too, especially gender violence. So let me turn to that now. so this is a chapter in my book that's called Protectors and Predators, kind of this Janus-faced Bill who protects, but he's also a predator at the same time. And I think this actually came also from those Western movies that they were watching in Kinshasa, because those movies were really replete with what I call rape scripts. And because Hollywood intended the movies to be a version of outdoor action story rather than a version of romance, Westerns had to present the cowboy as somebody who was inclined to die rather than really to marry. You don't really see that in a lot of those Western movies. A cowboy at the end of the movie, he's gonna marry somebody. You don't really have that because those movies were not intended to be romance movies. So, of course, the Bills grew extremely familiar with the recurring plot-based narrative of most of these films in which females appear only as hapless, clumsy characters to be rescued by heroic men. There's another thing that we have to add to that, to what I just said. It's the demographic situation in Kinshasa in the 1950s, where the male population largely outnumbered the female population. So because of that, girls in Kinshasa, especially in those townships, they really became some kind of trophies in gang fighting. So some gangs, for example, would make incursion into another gang's territory with the sole purpose of abducting a few girls and taking them back to their hangouts to have sex with them. And a gang felt particularly humiliated, not because it suffered defeat during a gang fight, but because 2 or maybe 3 of their township girls were corralled away and they were violated by a rival gang. So this really was worse than being trounced because it really exposed the gang's inability to protect their girls. That's really kind of calling into question their manhood, their masculinity. Are you really a man? Are you man if you are unable to protect the girls that reside in your neighborhood? Now, because obviously some of these activities were deviant, they were criminalized by colonial authorities, what happened is that the Bills in Kinshasa, they developed their own language called Indubile. Now, in Kinshasa, the lingua franca, the language that most people spoke in the 1950s was Lingala, Kikongo, and French. Those were the 3 languages spoken in Kinshasa in the 1950s. So in addition to those 3 languages, what the Bills did was to create their own argot, their own language, so that they could conceal some of the activities that they were partaking in from the adults and from the authorities. So I looked at that language, Indubile, and what I found is that 50% of the vocabulary dealt with only 2 things: drug consumption and girls. That's a language, It's the language where 50% of the vocabulary, is concerned with only 2 things, 2 activities, girls and drug consumptions. All the terms that you see here, they were ecumenical, meaning that they were used by all gang members, regardless of the township in which they lived. But other terms were parochial, meaning that they circulated only within a close-knit township, not beyond. So it's imagined, so Indubile is the argot, the main language, and then you have variants or you have dialects of Indubile in different neighborhoods or townships of Kinshasa. Some of the terms would come from French, from Lingala, they would mix. Some of them also would come from some of the movies that they were watching. For example, to be a loser was called to be a yuma. This was a very ecumenical term, yuma. If you've watched that movie 310 to Yuma, you know what I'm talking about. So for them, after watching that movie, they decided, okay, we're going to use yuma as a term to say that somebody is so weak and so a wimp, a loser. Okay. On the left there, master. Master obviously comes from the English term mister. So a master is a buddy in their argot, in their language. So I am nearing now the end of my presentation, and I want to talk to you about the end of the Bill movement, because it's really interesting the way this whole movement kind of petered out at the end of the, not really the end, at the beginning of the 1960s, I would say. So it didn't really last too long, but still, it lasted maybe a decade or so, a little more, 15 years, 20 years in Kinshasa. And I want to show you how the movement kind of was kind of very gradually disappeared. Two reasons. The first reason is the ministry of a maverick Belgian priest by the name of Joseph de Laat. I met him in 2006, and he passed away in 2009. So I was very, very lucky to meet this guy because he played such an important role in the Bill movement. He arrived in Kinshasa in 1957. You have a picture of him when he freshly arrived in Kinshasa. He was extremely young. What was interesting about him is that before even he arrived in Kinshasa, he could speak Lingala. He could understand this very important language, because you cannot be living in Kinshasa without speaking Lingala. So he had learned Lingala in Belgium before setting foot in Congo in 1957. So he arrived in Kinshasa. He befriends Bill in the neighborhood in his parish. He learns Bill. He told me that he was even preaching the gospel in Bill. He said to me when I met with him in 2006 that he even mused about translating the entire Bible in the Bill language, which was quite interesting. So he even, as I mentioned to you, marijuana was so key. You cannot approach those young people without smoking marijuana. He smoked marijuana with them. He actually confessed that in the 1969 interview. So I did my research and I found this interview of him in 1969 saying that, yeah, he had no choice, because he really wanted to fit in. And he understood that the only way to fit in with those young people so that he could redeem them, help them, was to smoke marijuana with them. When I reminded him of that story in 2006, when I met with him, he said, no, I never actually smoked marijuana. That's not true. They had stuffed my pipe with some marijuana, and then when I never inhale. I didn't have marijuana with them. So I said, but there was this interview in 1969, so it was quite interesting. So what he did, what this guy did, was to very gradually, he attracted the Bills to a youth center that he set up in his parish in the heart of Kinshasa's Tropical West. That center had a bakery, a restaurant, music. Young people could play music. Young Bills were trained in different trades. He endeared himself to the Bills so much so that they nicknamed him Père Buffalo, which means Father Buffalo. He also, and this was so critical for my study, for me to be able to write this book, is that he provided the Bills with an outlet to express themselves. So he created this makeshift magazine by the name of Esprit de la Jeunesse, Spirit of Youth, that widely circulated in Kinshasa. And it was interesting because it contained lots of information that was so useful for me to do my research. But what I understood is that this esprit de la jeunesse, or spirit of youth, was also very important because it contributed to the standardization of Indubile as a language, because the Bills were writing in Indubile in this magazine. So to some degree, it really kind of helped their language become more standard. Yeah, so he was key. He was absolutely key to kind of help those young people enter adult life and, you know, stop the movement and stop the violence and consuming marijuana and so on. The second reason why the movement disappeared is President Mobutu. You have at the very top a picture of President Mobutu with President Kennedy because he visited the United States. Mobutu became president in 1965, but in 1960, he had set up a coup d'etat, and he was more or less controlling politics in Congo until 1965, when he became kind of the official leader from 1965 all the way to 1997. So when Mobutu took over as a result of this military coup, he knew very well that in order to secure his grip on Kinshasa, the capital city of the new independent country, he needed the support of those young people. So the only way for him to do that was to reach out to those grand bills, you know, the older bills who basically held sway in most of Kinshasa's townships. So what he did, I think, that really kind of dealt a blow to the movement was to co-opt some of those grand bills in his inner circle. And then very gradually, he promoted them into senior positions in his cabinet. And that was a way for him to kind of neutralize the bill movement, because he knew that that movement was extremely dangerous. Because one thing that I didn't tell you is that in 1959, those bills were really instrumental in a huge insurrection in the Belgian Congo that basically kind of dealt a blow to the Belgian colonization, that kind of ended Belgian colonization very quickly. If it weren't for them, you know, the Congolese wouldn't have gotten their independence in 1960. So Mobutu knew about that. He knew that those young people had to be controlled if he really wanted to assert his power. So here, clockwise, from the upper left corner, there are people who were former grand bills in Kinshasa. They were co-opted into Mobutu's cabinet. The very first one, José Patrick Nimi Maïdika, he became Mobutu's senior advisor, but he used to be a bill. The second one, his name is Paul-Henri Kabaïdi. He was appointed governor of the city of Kinshasa, a former bill. And then at the very bottom, we have a guy by the name of Jean-Jacques Kande. He served as Minister of Information under Mobutu's cabinet. And then the last one is Igor Bobinansomi, was Congo's last ambassador to the UN under Mobutu's regime. Other bills, former bills, were promoted in the military. Some became very famous musicians in Congo. And what's interesting about Congolese music is that because in the 1960s, the first kind of modern Congolese musicians were former bills, they kind of incorporated a lot of the bill language into Congolese music of the 1960s. So I'd like to end this presentation with a standard question I used to ask my informants. Here's the question: how do Congolese remember the bills today? So this was kind of my standard question. At the end of the interview, I would ask them, so how do you think people today, you know, remember those bills of the 1950s and the 1960s? When I asked that question to one of my informants, this is the answer that I got from him. He replied and he said, we don't remember them, they are still around with us. So I'm going to end with that interesting quote, and then I would gladly entertain some questions, field some questions, and try to answer them to the best of my ability. Thank you for listening to me, even though I cannot see you.
Thank you, Didier. That was fantastic. And
Oh, thank you very much, Leslie.
yeah. We have a few minutes for questions. If you have a question for Didier, you can type it into the Q&A box. We're getting a lot of thank yous, very good lectures. And so you actually kind of answered one of the questions that I had, was how do young people view Buffalo Bill, or, like what kind of legend does Buffalo Bill have in Kinshasa today? Are young people aware of even just the figure of Buffalo Bill today?
Well, Leslie, excellent question. I think there is a disconnect. So in Kinshasa today, people wouldn't be able to connect the bills. They know about the bills, right? But they wouldn't connect the bills with Buffalo Bill. They probably would connect the bills with American Westerns, Westerns, but not necessarily the figure of Buffalo Bill. Because I think that that connection was severed at some point, but they know the term bill. They would say, oh, this person is a bill, or this person is a bill, or this is a bill. Or, yeah, of course, they know about that culture. But the connection with Buffalo Bill, unfortunately, has been lost.
Okay.
But there is still a connection with American Westerns, because they know that those young people were very much impacted, influenced by American Western movies.
Great, thank you. Okay, so we have a question. Did the Bills often dress like cowboys?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. So it seems to me, after doing this research, so you had some that, because at some point they were influenced also by the peplums. Leslie, have you heard of the peplum movies? The peplum movies we call them also the sword and sandal movies. They were extremely popular in the 1950s and 1960s, like Hercules, or what else? With strong man, those Italian movies, they are called peplum movies. So some of the Bills prefer those movies over Western movies. You see, so some of those movies, they like a Spartacus. Spartacus is a peplum movie, Spartacus, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so they wouldn't dress up like cowboys, but they would call themselves still Bills, but not dress up like cowboys. Those who really dressed up like cowboys are the ones that were influenced by Western movies and just loved Western movies. Yes, absolutely. They would dress up like cowboys, but they would have fake pistols, of course, not the real pistols, but the hat, the checkered shirt, the boots, the spurs. One of my informants told me that at some point they were like, we cannot be cowboys without horses, so we need horses. So there was a place in Kinshasa where white people were actually, they had that as a sport. They kept horses, and they were riding horses, and they decided to go and steal some of the horses and ride them back into their township. But it just, they were not able to do that. They didn't succeed. And then what I need to add is that just because they didn't have access to horses, they decided to transform their bikes into horses. So they would ride bikes the way somebody would ride horses. They would remove the brakes, and yeah. So one of the guys that I spoke with, one of my informants, his his bike was named Silver. You know who Silver is, Leslie?
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So in the neighborhood, people say, "Hey, he is here. Yeah, look at him. You know, he comes with Silver. You know, Silver was the name, of course, of Lone Ranger's the Lone Ranger's horse, and it was this guy's bike. So you really see kind of how they really kind of trying to mimic some of the elements of Western movies, and especially The Lone Ranger, because The Lone Ranger was really a quintessential movie that really kind of influenced their movement.
That's so interesting. So we'll wrap it up with one last question.
Sure.
And what the question is, did the Bills gain popularity in other African countries at the time that they were popular in Kinshasa? Are you aware?
No, of course. Yeah, they were cowboy movements in several places in Africa, because I had to do that research to show that yes, Kinshasa was unique, but it wasn't so unique, you see. So I found some cowboys in Nigeria. I found some in Tanzania. In Nigeria, they were kind of in the 1940s, you know, in the 1940s, and they were more like bands, but they weren't really involved in gang fighting and things like that, you know, and they were not also dressing up like cowboys like we see in Kinshasa. So yeah, I did my research and I came to the conclusion that the movement in Kinshasa was very unique. You know, unique because of the names. They had cowboy names. Yeah. Names of actors and names of characters of the far West. For example, you have people that were named John Wayne. John Wayne was a name, you see. So if here in this game, Township A, somebody decided to take the name John Wayne, and then Township B, there's another John Wayne in Township B, you had to fight. So they would organize a ritualized fight between the two John Waynes, and the one who wins retains that name, and the other one had to give up the name John Wayne and find another Wayne, because another name, because you were defeated by the real John Wayne, right?
That's so interesting. This is really just, I think this whole topic is so fascinating. And I really appreciate you taking the time to share just a snippet of your research with us.
I appreciate that.
And I want to thank everyone who joined us tonight for the program. If you're interested in learning more about this topic, I highly recommend checking out Didier's book, Tropical Cowboys. It goes into more depth and all of this subject. But otherwise, thank you for joining us, and I hope you have a great weekend.
Thank you, Leslie. You too. Bye.
Bye.